Is there any set of ideas that you feel so strongly about that you'd die for them? Maybe it's freedom, democracy, the country even. And with war in Europe and further abroad, it's a question that I can't help but wrestle with at the moment. What would I do if called to make the ultimate sacrifice for what I believed in? It's these sort of questions that we're going to be wrestling with today as we read the first works in our great books reading list. That's Plato's Apology and a dialogue called Crito. Before we begin, I just want to note quickly how surprised I was by how approachable and readable these works are. I really recommend that you read them. They're not very long, like a lot of old works. They're all available for free now on the internet, and I'll link down below in the description. I was blown away by the prose and eloquence of Plato, but I have to admit the dialogues take some getting used to. There's quite a bit of repetition in them. I've seen these sort of Socratic dialogues in more modern texts, and it's interesting now to finally read what they've been inspired by. I should also point out that these two works, the Apology and Crito, are the only work that doesn't appear chronologically in one of the years of the reading plan. And Adler did that deliberately. He was so infused with how important these works were to your understanding. It's going to be useful to give you some additional context to the historical figures that we're going to be talking about today. This is by no means a comprehensive introduction. Even if you've got no interest in philosophy, you've probably heard of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Maybe you've heard the phrase Platonic relationship. The influence of these figures on Western thought can't be overstated, dominating philosophical inquiry for 2,000 odd years. Plato, who is the writer of these pieces, was a student of Socrates. Socrates was an ancient Greek philosopher, and he didn't write anything down. Plato wrote it all down. And though that's strictly not true, the discussion around the authenticity of the dialogues and how much is Socrates and how much is Plato is very interesting, but maybe a topic for another time. These writings are the dialogues of Socrates, and they might be some of the most studied philosophical texts ever. Socrates himself was a bit of a character, and he was probably quite the bother. His method of doing philosophy, the Socratic dialogue, is still a popular teaching tool, something a little bit like this. Hey, you, sorry? What does justice mean? You know, justice. What is it? I guess it's doing good things to good people and bad things to bad people. So bad people never do good things. I can't really say that I know Socrates. Well, in which case we might consider, and so on. Most of the dialogues conclude with Socrates determining that his counterpart doesn't really know much about wisdom or virtue, and this is often called aporia, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is a state of philosophical confusion that you're unable to resolve. You can imagine that this might have got under people's nerves, and it did. The Apology, which isn't really a dialogue per se, and Crito, which is, form the middle two works of a tetralogy, which means 4 works, that covers the accusation, the trial, and the death of Socrates. The title of the dialogues, such as Crito, refer to one of the other characters in the dialogue usually. The Apology is a recording of what Socrates said in his defence at his trial. Socrates was accused of 2 crimes, corrupting the youth of Athens, and impiety. Now let's back up a little bit so that we can understand where these 2 accusations came from. It's just after the Peloponnesian War, battle between the Greek city-states of Athens and Sparta. You might have heard of that one. Sparta win, they overthrow the Athenian democracy, and they instill their own oligarchical regime, the 30 tyrants. 8 months later, the tyrants have been overthrown for being useless, and democracy has been reinstated. Now, as you can probably guess, everybody's looking to point fingers. Unfortunately for Socrates, he's been advocating for an elite ruling class for a long time. Moreover, several of those tyrants were his students. We'll have another look at these ideas when we get round to one of Plato's most famous works, which is the Republic. As to the claim of impiety, we get the impression during the trial that this is somewhat of a trumped-up charge that's been brought around just to harm him. It's true that he's been asking in his usual annoying Socratic way questions about religion and sometimes comparing the gods to suns or stones, using it in the trial as a sort of political master move by his accusers, taking what once was probably quite innocent and manipulating the situation to paint him as this corrupter. Socrates refuses to use his influence and power to defend himself, only stating why the charges brought are unjust and accusing Athens of doing more harm to itself than it is doing to him. His refusal to play the game, so to speak, and get a lesser sentence like exile is ultimately what costs him his life. If you've ever heard that famous quote, "The unexamined life is not worth living," that comes from the Apology. Socrates relates a story in the trial that gives us some sense of why this trial might suddenly have come to a head, and a useful look into what he considered to be wisdom. As the story goes, somebody has gone to the oracle in Delphi and asked them, "Who is the wisest person in the world?" And the oracle answers, "The wisest person in the world is Socrates." Now Socrates, he's quite taken back by this, not considering himself to be wise at all. You'll remember earlier I mentioned that state of aporia, of confusion that he was always seeking. To solve this puzzle of why the god said that he was the wisest, he's decided to seek out all of the wisest people in society and figure out if they're really wise. So he goes around asking all of these rich and important and proud people these questions. He eventually decides that none of them are particularly wise, which probably annoyed quite a lot of them, and which is why maybe he ended up at trial. But more to the point, Socrates realizes that he's the only person that realizes that he's not wise, and that maybe it's this that makes him the wisest person in the world. Now, I think the first thing I'd like to discuss here is that we shouldn't be afraid to criticize Socrates, even though he is this extraordinarily famous philosopher. There's this sort of interesting interplay happening between dogmatic belief and pragmatic belief. It's compromising such that you achieve what you set out to achieve, even if you don't do it in the most pure way, really such a crime. Especially in this case, Socrates' questioning of all these people undoubtedly has upset them, though he's searching for truth. Is this really the best way of going about it? Another claim that is made in this text is that he hears the voices of gods, and that's sure to ruffle some feathers in the very pious society of Athens. I guess that Socrates' answer to this would be that the search for truth outweighs all of these concerns, which, while noble, does make me wonder to what extent that we can use such an extreme viewpoint as Socrates is advocating for here. But it might just be that in the context of my day-to-day life, that the situations I encounter don't have sufficient gravitas to use a philosophy like this. I think the important takeaway from this story, regardless of its truth, is that we shouldn't overestimate what we know. And I'm especially wary of this as I produce these videos and make content online and join the rest of the intellectual influencers, so to speak. Like the supposed wise men that Socrates goes about embarrassing, me and other people like me, we're reading from scripts that we've pre-prepared. We make an effort to sound much more intelligent and wise than maybe we are in our day-to-day actions. If we start to believe our own bullshit, it leads to hubris and ultimately to failure. Now, Crito is a dialogue with a friend of Socrates by the same name that takes place in the prison after Socrates has been sentenced to death. Crito wants Socrates to escape with him, and we understand this to be quite easy. They've got the money, they can bribe the guards, they've got a route, they can get him out, they can get him away from Athens. But Socrates refuses. One of Crito's concerns is that other people will think that instead of spending the money to save Socrates' life, he preferred his own wealth to the life of his friend. In Socrates' opinion, this concern is complete nonsense. Socrates uses the example of an Olympian in training for the gymnastics. And in that training, in that pursuit of Olympic glory, who would he listen to? Would he listen to the masses about how to eat, how to train? No. Crito is forced to admit that he wouldn't. Who would he listen to then? He would listen to his coach, a man that knew exactly what to do to achieve Olympic glory. And in Socrates' view, so too should we consider who really knows virtue and wisdom and how to live. If we decide to listen to the masses who know nothing of wisdom and virtue, we are going to corrupt our higher ideals, and it will only lead us to evil. After all, these Socratic dialogues that we're witnessing are constantly demonstrating that the masses know very little. And after all, I guess from Socrates' point of view, it was the masses that convicted him. I think this idea of being careful who we listen to is true in two different ways. The first is that if we try and behave in a way that's going to please everybody the most, that's going to be no good. It's just not possible. This sort of populist idea is very common in our politics nowadays, and I don't think it's a good thing. The people, as in Socrates' view, don't exactly know what they want and aren't necessarily going to select the best thing. The second idea is one that we hear all the time, which of course is that we shouldn't worry what people think of us. Here it's presented in the context of choosing your own standard to hold yourself to, that we derive through our own personal examination and our own personal reflection on what is right and what is wrong. And that's an idea that we're going to encounter in the Stoics as well. They hold that we shouldn't worry about anything that we can't control. Inherently, the thoughts of others are something that we can't control. Socrates is constantly emphasizing, both in the Apology and his dialogue with Crito, that he's not afraid to die. He's got a couple of different reasons why this is the case. In the main, Socrates describes himself as quite advanced in years. I think he's roughly 70 years old when these events are taking place. And because of this old age, he doesn't have much life left. And so, in which case, why should he be scared of what's ultimately going to happen anyway? He alludes to another argument, which I'm sure most of us are familiar with, which is that if death is like unconscious sleep, then why would you be afraid of it? Because unconscious sleep is quite blissful. You know, another common presentation of this idea might be that you didn't exist for an unimaginably long time before you were born, and you won't exist for an unimaginably long time after you die. So there is a symmetry there between your non-existence, which you don't worry about before birth, and your non-existence after death, which for some reason you worry about. Now, I can see the logic in this sort of argument. I've just never found it that satisfying. It does nothing to quell the terror of the idea that one day I won't be alive. And his last point, which is sort of the most idealistic of the lot, is that if death is not an eternal nothing, which would be totally fine, then it must be that he is with the gods, and he's free to discuss with Homer and Hesiod all of the great ideas and finally find out what justice and truth and love and beauty is. I hope that's the truth. But maybe more useful to our actual practice is the idea that he isn't afraid to die, because to live in abandonment of your higher ideals is no life at all. In Crito, he demonstrates all the different ways that he might cling to what he describes as a miserable slice of life, and how they're all unsatisfactory to him. If he chooses now at the most critical part of his life to abandon his philosophy and make a run for it, then he is exactly what the court has accused him of, a corrupter of the youth. He has spent his time teaching the youth, and if he doesn't really act out in what he believes, then that means that his beliefs are wrong, they are unjust, and now he's taught the wrong ideas to the youth. He argues that he owes his life to the state of Athens, as he owes it to his parents, and that he must respect the laws of the state of Athens, even in this case. If he decides to flee in exile, the only life left for him would be one where he decided to commit a wrong only so that he could survive, and that life would not be worth living. It's clear to me that even after everything that's happened, Socrates still believes in the ideals of Athens, and he's willing to not only die for his own belief, but also these ideals of the state that has just convicted him. How do we know that a system of laws and ideas is just, even if it acts wrongly against us? How do we know if the system is corrupt? How are we to properly examine a society that we must assume is wiser than us, and that its laws and precepts have come from people that exceed us in intellectual and spiritual capacity? The answer to this is not yet clear to me, and it relates to one of the most fundamental motivators of this intellectual journey. If we're to understand and talk critically about the world around us, we have to know in detail the ideas of which it was constructed on. It's worth asking ourselves, what would we be willing to die for? Would we be willing to die for our own personal moral standard? Or would we, like Socrates refused to, try every trick in the trade to soften our sentence? Would we, as Socrates refused to, bring out our children and family and let them wail and cry and plead for mercy to try and soften the jury? At every stage, Socrates refuses to take action that would save his life, including offering an unacceptable counter-sentence to the death penalty. He must have known that this would have been refused. Reflecting on this question can really interrogate our moral systems, clearing out the ideas that we don't truly believe. I dare say that if you can't die by what you believe, do you really believe it? And if you don't really believe it, then how can you put it into practice? I think the last thing that I want to note about these works is a question that Crito puts forward to Socrates about his children. He says, "No man should bring children into this world who is unwilling to persevere to the end in their nurture and education." And I can't say that I disagree with Crito here. I think this touches onto a common critique of some of the Hellenistic schools of philosophy, which many find makes it an unsatisfactory system of beliefs. They say it's often too cold, and you could go as far as to say uncaring when it comes to friends and families. In fact, the Stoics took this much further than what we're looking at here, which is they actually claimed that the emotions relating to family and friends were a burden. If you don't want to be upset when your loved ones die, then you should remind yourself that you never had them for that long anyway. Socrates' answer eventually in the dialogue is that if he stayed alive, his children wouldn't be able to stay in Athens. And if they weren't in Athens, he would be depriving them of that state. Because he'd done this wrong in staying alive, he would be an unjust teacher anyway. So it was much more satisfactory to him that he should die and his friends should educate his children. I can't say that I find that satisfactory at all. Maybe Socrates would argue that our allegiance and love for family and friends is an impediment to his mission of searching real truth. And I admit I've only just begun reading Plato, and maybe these ideas are more expanded on in the rest of the text, and I hope that they are, because I think they're very interesting. But at the moment I find the sort of ethic that thinking that you being dead would be better for your children in this case somewhat disturbing. We're just getting our feet wet in this colossal collection of books, and I'm really excited to read the next work, The Clouds by Aristophanes. It's a suitable next chapter for us in this journey, as Socrates is actually in this comic play, and it's one of the reasons why we know Socrates was a real person and not just a figment of Plato's imagination. What's also exciting about this is, whereas I might be more familiar with philosophy, I've never read a Greek drama, so we'll be in totally uncharted waters. And the great thing about all of these old works is that you don't need to buy a book set like this to study them, and I've included links down below where you can read them too, as well as more resources on the great books of the Western world. My name's been Harry Smith, this is Pages to Practice, and thank you so much for listening.